Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to yet another general ramble of Strange Playgrounds. It's been a trying period, has it not, for everyone out there? It really has, and like I've been proclaiming on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, part of what has helped me through this period is just diving deep into any and all kinds of media, any and all kinds of fiction. I've been rabidly just buying books for my Kindle and just hardback, paperback, physical volumes. Of any and all description, it's a rare week where there has not been some delivery that has not been crammed full of books or comics or something to that effect. Some of them borrowed from friends. Those of you who listen regularly will know Lex Jones, fellow writer. He lent me a series of comic books, actually. I've been out of sort of like the Marvel superhero stuff for a long time. I haven't really dipped toe into it for a very, very long time. I find that there are periods that I like, and there are the works of certain writers and artists that I like. Beyond that, I find it difficult to get into. For lots of different reasons. I remember when I first started reading like superhero comics when I was a teenager. I started reading a series called, I think it was called The Astonishing Spider-Man, which basically it was a really well presented comic, very good quality paper, and it was very dense and thick. And what it was reprints of issues and stories that had already been printed in the US but hadn't really had a release in the UK. And I started reading just at the very beginning of the Clone Saga in Spider-Man, which I know everyone hates the Clone Saga, right? But what people tend to forget is that at the beginning, the Clone Saga was really interesting. It was really interesting because it moved things on. It wasn't just the status quo. So what made me pick it up was I idly leafed through a copy at the local newsagents, and I found this very strange, very adult story in which Peter Parker wasn't a kid anymore. He wasn't like a college student or anything. He was grown up. He was a middle-aged guy. He was married. He had a job. He had a baby on the way. And there were all of these weird sort of existential doubts addressed because he'd met Ben Reilly, who, as it turns out, there was a lot of sort of confusion at the beginning as to who was... Ben Reilly is basically another Peter Parker. He's another Peter Parker who he happens to meet on a New York rooftop, and there's this moment of existential doubt where nobody knows quite who is who. For the longest time, Ben Reilly thinks that he's the clone of Peter Parker. But it turns out in the midst of the story that Peter Parker, the character who has been Spider-Man for the last 5 years, is actually the clone. And that was, I thought, a really brave thing. And it's so clear that that's what they intended it to be. They intended that to be the new status quo. And it was really, really interesting. I loved all that stuff. You had all of this existential angst where the Peter Parker character had to deal with the fact that he was not Peter Parker, that he was actually a clone who had been living the life of Peter Parker for the last God knows how many years, who had effectively been Spider-Man. You had Ben Reilly having to deal with the resentment that he felt because the clone had effectively taken his life for the past 5 years, albeit unwittingly. All that stuff is really cool. All that stuff is really interesting. And then they drop the ball. They drop the ball at the end. They get cold feet and they use it as an excuse to hit the big reset button and bring back the status quo. I hate that. I hate it in any story. I particularly hate it in the superhero comics because they do it all the time. When the universes get too saturated, when they get too close to things changing, to things actually being different, they reset. They press the big universe reset button. It's usually a metaphysical thing. So it's often the case that some superpowered semi-divine entity hits the big reset button and the universe physically resets. It's someone like Franklin Richards could do it, you know? And I hate it. I hate it to bits. One of the reasons I hate it is it makes these universes pointless. It doesn't matter what happens in them. Death doesn't matter. Tragedy doesn't matter. Genocide doesn't matter, because there are ways of just hitting the big reset button and making everything different, making everything all right again. Nothing has any weight or consequence. What started to happen towards the end of the Clone Saga, first of all, because the fan base was so conservative and hated the fact that the Peter Parker they'd been following for the last God knows how many years was in fact a clone. They hated that so much, so Marvel basically very hurriedly rewrote it, even though it makes no sense. It makes no sense. They rewrote it so that Ben Reilly was the clone after all. It was so boring. It was so boring. And I remember after that, I just stopped reading. It was like, well, you've undone the last God knows how many years of storytelling. It was getting really interesting. And after that, they start railing it back in. After all of the really interesting stuff that happened throughout the Clone Saga, that actually moved the status and the story of Spider-Man on, they start to rein it back in, and they start to resurrect all of the old characters who were dead, whose deaths actually meant something. Characters like Gwen Stacy. If you can resurrect Gwen Stacy, then what's the point? Gwen Stacy's death is such a seminal point in the Spider-Man canon. What's the point? The same is true of Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin. They resurrected him after so many years, and it's like, come on. If it's that simple, why? What does it matter? Death means fuck all in this universe, and it's really annoying. I don't like it in any storytelling. A lot of popular science fiction does it. You'll find it happening in a lot of cartoons, for example. A lot of children's cartoons do it. There's a tragedy, there's a situation, there's a cataclysm, and then there's a big reset button that puts it all back. Doctor Who does it. Doctor Who does it all the bloody time, where there are significant events that change sometimes the shape of history and the universe at large. And then there's some science fiction gobbledygook where they just hit the big reset button, everything goes back to normal, status quo is restored, and it really, really annoys me. Now, these comics that Lex gave to me were the Immortal Hulk series. It was the first 4 or 5 issues of the Immortal Hulk series. And it's really fascinating on a number of levels. First of all, metaphysically, it establishes the notion that the Hulk isn't just like a science fiction experiment gone wrong. He's actually some sort of metaphysical entity that has slipped through into Bruce Banner's mind as a result of the explosion, which is really interesting. He's almost like a semi-infernal or divine archetype, and it's called the Immortal Hulk because that's absolutely true. He's immortal in a way that many of the characters in the Marvel Universe aren't. There are instances in this comic where he gets ripped apart, he gets dismembered, and bits of him get scattered. They get stored in separate jars and places, and each individual bit is still alive. Not only that, but there's a great issue where it shows you the end of everything. It shows you the ultimate end of all creation, all universes, and one of the last 2 creatures alive is the Hulk. Bruce Banner, the Hulk. That's how bad it gets. Bruce Banner can't die. He even engineers in this series, he engineers his own suicide. He gets Hawkeye to shoot him with an arrow in the head, and it doesn't work. It actually doesn't work. It doesn't take. He can't die. And that's brilliant. The comic actually deals with the angst of that. It deals with the confusion and the ambiguity of that, what that actually means. It really tackles the moral ambiguity of the Hulk itself, what it represents on a sort of human level, on a societal level. What is the Hulk? It's a disaster waiting to happen, yeah? What I love is later in the series where Bruce Banner, not the Hulk, Bruce Banner has this series of political and existential revelations where he says, he actually invokes one of the core hypocrisies of the superhero mythology. He points the finger. He says, Stark, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Captain America, the Avengers, all these guys ever do is restore the status quo. That's all they fight for. He says they have the power to end corruption, they can end political corruption, war, pollution, they have the means to do it, and they don't. And he points out that that humanity is on the fast track to self-extinction, to self-destruction. And he actually engineers, he becomes what would, I suppose, would be considered a terrorist. He basically engineers this situation where he it's like he becomes a political activist, and he says, okay, I have all this power. What I'm going to do is, whilst are no consequences for corporations that are destroying our political and cultural structures, our societal systems, whilst there are no consequences for greedy and corrupt politicians, whilst there are no consequences for war criminals and corrupt police officials, I am going to unleash the Hulk. There is going to be a disaster for every day this is not addressed, because that's what humanity needs. That's what humanity needs to bring it back in line. And this is Bruce Banner. This is like the hero talking. And I kind of love it. I kind of love the fact that the comic dares go there, because it's very anti-Marvel. It's very anti-Disney in a way, which obviously owns Marvel at the moment. It's very anti-corporate. I absolutely love the fact that the comic has gone there. Beyond that, it's got all of this wonderful imagery in it. It's really very grotesque, but also very beautiful. It's got a lot of metaphysics in it. It's got some very sincere portrayals of alien cultures and extra-dimensional anatomies and systems. It's absolutely beautiful at times. It's a genuinely visionary bit of work. This is what I tend to find with comic books. I like runs of comic books. I like it when they're not obliged to tackle things like canon or, what other writers have done, because it never works. I mean, they've got to, shoehorn themselves into a pre-existing canon. You get diluted work, unfortunately. You get diluted work. When you've got writers who have got a vision for the characters and for the mythologies, and they are allowed to run with them to produce a finite run, which is a finite story, you get good work. In fact, you get sublime work. You get absolutely stunning work. You get the early Frank Miller stuff, before he completely went off the deep end and became a right-wing shill. You get things like Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, which is still one of the best comic books I've ever read. Absolutely beautiful. But yeah, that was wonderful. That was absolutely wonderful to experience. Recently, I rediscovered, I haven't read it for a very, very, very long time, but I was on my Kindle and just trawling through stuff that I could read, and I found Moby Dick. I found Moby Dick, which I haven't read for years. And I mean, so long, I've forgotten most of it, But I've started reading that again, and it's absolutely joyous, Moby Dick is. It's an absolutely joyous book. It is about dark themes. It's about very dark human themes. It's got stuff like obsession, the lionization of people that you probably shouldn't lionize, and how normal people can come under the sway of demagogues. That's part of what it's about. There's a lot of deprivation, there's a lot of misery, there's a lot of suffering in the book, but even when it goes to those places, there's something about the prose and about the enthusiasm that Melville has for describing what he's describing, where it feels celebratory. It's so weird in that regard, even when they're in the depths of Ahab's obsession, and it's killing them. It is literally killing them. They're all starving by the end of this book because they're following that bloody white whale into the where this ship shouldn't go, where the Pequod should not go. It's quite brilliant. It's still beautiful. There's something about it where it's not judgmental. It's so strange. It's not. It doesn't condemn. It doesn't ever descend into the depths of despair. It's still celebratory. It's even funny. That surprised me this time round. There are genuine moments of physical humour in this book, and they're framed in an almost farcical manner. There's situations like there's a point at the beginning where it's all from the perspective of Ishmael, right? Call me Ishmael, yeah. There's a point where he ends up in Nantucket, yeah, and he doesn't know where he's going. He hasn't got anything. It's freezing. All the the soles of his boots are worn out, and he can feel the frost on the floor, and he's trying to find somewhere to stay. And all the places he goes are crap. They're all either too expensive, or they're too dirty, or they're too run down. And he ends up going into this place which he thinks will be hospitable. But it turns out what it actually is one of Nantucket's segregated black churches of the time. So he is like a total outsider there. And he describes this scene where he blunders in, and this sea of faces just turn to him. It's silently and kind of judgmentally, and he has to very quietly and apologetically back out. And it's really funny. It is a genuine moment of physical humor, and you get that all the way through. There's humor of language, of course. There's a lot of wit, there's a lot of dialogue and bantering and whatnot, but there's also this incredible physical humor, which is part and parcel of the story. I mean, the physicality of the book it's very immediate. There's a sensual element to Herman Melville's prose, where he talks about like what people are feeling, what they're experiencing, and what they're doing physically. There's a lot of description of what goes on board the ship. Yeah, what is necessary to keep the ship functioning. You can tell that Melville had a lot of time for this, you know? He was really interested in this subject and really wants you as the reader to understand how interesting it is. It's a marker of fiction written in the era, to be honest. A lot of fiction of the era is like this, where you've got writers who are often educated people. They're often experts in certain areas, and they want to express that. They want you to understand that. And that's what you get in Moby Dick. It's actually really beautiful. I'm reading that alongside Look Homeward Angel by Thomas Wolfe. And Look Homeward Angel is one of those classic American novels. It's apparently fairly autobiographical, and that in and of itself is fascinating. It's huge. It's an enormous book, and by all accounts was edited down from an original 60,000 words. The original book was massive and written in this very stream of consciousness style. You can tell because it's so weird. It's so weirdly structured. It's like it takes this God's eye view. It's not, whereas obviously Herman Melville's book is from the perspective of Ishmael, so it's very down to earth, it's very immediate. This one, Look Homeward Angel, draws back, and you look down from an almost celestial perspective on these characters who run around like insects or like toys, living out their lives, experiencing their myriad disappointments and despairs, and that's one of the things I love about the book, actually. Contrasted to Moby Dick, which is celebratory for the most part, Look Homeward Angel is a paean of misery. It's all about the despair of life. It's about the disappointment of living. And it follows that through multiple generations. There's no one particular anchor point. The book is split into 3 sections, where you get the sort of forefather character who is based on Thomas Wolfe's own father, by all accounts, he becomes an alcoholic. He's kind of a despairing person to begin with. He becomes fairly abusive to his family. And then it follows his son through various instances of his life, and how how the disappointments and the failures of one feed into the other. It's really interesting. I mean, it's a brilliant book. It's beautifully written. Thomas Wolfe has got this really strange way of writing, because it's written in a stream of consciousness style, despite the fact that it's sort of trenchantly realist. There's no fantastical subjects here. It feels like there could be. Because of the way the prose is written, it's more like it's almost like a dream. It's got that feeling about it. It feels like there could or even should be something supernatural happening, but there isn't. It's really weird, but I love it. I'm actually really, really enjoying it. Because of its despairing tone, it's actually a fairly good book to be reading in our times, you know? It reflects the mood quite well. It's all about defeated ambition and defeated love, and how you can try and you can follow what's prescribed for you, and it will still lead to failure. It will still lead to disappointment. It will still lead to bitterness, you know? There's a real darkness in this book, a real heart of darkness, and I kind of love it. I've got to say, I kind of love it. The reason I picked it up is I've heard of it before. I mean, Thomas Wolfe is one of the great American writers. I've heard of it before. But there's a reference to it in a video game I love, Realms of the Haunting, very old 1996 Gremlin FMV horror game. You can pick up a copy of Look Homeward Angel in the game, and it does nothing. It does nothing. It's a useless item. But it seems to have some sort of like symbolic resonance within the game. So I was like, well, I kind of want to know what it means. I kind of want to know why it's there. So I picked up Look Homeward Angel to read, and I'm loving it. I do have a thing for those great American writers, the ones who are describing their lives and their experiences and their ambitions, and that sort of like the shaping of the American landscape. I do have a penchant for that, I've got to say. There's something very epic and very beautiful about it all, There's a sense in many of them of frontiership, of it being of there being endless possibilities and vistas and horizons, whereas Thomas Wolfe is kind of the opposite. He shows you the folly of that, of that dream. He actually undercuts it massively by giving you a very real experience. It's very cool. It's very, very cool, and I can highly recommend it. It is dense. It's not a book to read if you're not in the mood for something truly epic. And to be honest, I probably shouldn't be reading it alongside Moby Dick, should I? Because they're both huge. They're both ridiculously huge. But it's one of those books where, yeah, it's friggin' huge, but it doesn't feel like it's friggin' huge. It actually breezes by because it's so easy to read. The prose is so lyrical and so pretty and so poetic and has this cadence that's almost mellifluous. It's almost like poetry. Love it to bits. I've also been, for the purposes of a script that I'm writing at the moment, the script for a TV series called Hymns of Aberice, if we can ever get it made, which is based on my short story collection, Born in Blood. It's based on the mythology of Born in Blood, actually. It's a bit more narrative than Born in Blood is, because Born in Blood is like a mythological thing, really. I've been reading a lot of poetry. There's a lot of influence from romantic poetry in Hymns of Aberice in terms of its metaphysics. So I've returned to Blake. I've reread totally the Songs of Innocence and Experience. I've reread Urizen. Blake is my favourite poet in the world. Gun to head, I mean, it's difficult to say because poets are so of their time. They're reflecting something of their era. They each have their own qualities, so it's difficult to say what's your favourite. Some days I might be in the mood for like Allen Ginsberg. I might be in the mood for some beat poetry, some American poetry, On another day I might be in the mood for John Donne or John Milton or Dante or whatever, depending on what I'm feeling. But gun to head, my favourite poets are the Romantics, because their perspectives on many things chime with mine. Their philosophies chime with mine. Their metaphysics chimes with mine. Their metaphysics informs mine. I mean, if you read a lot of my fiction, you'll find Blake everywhere. You'll find references to Blake all the way through my fiction, and also to Byron, to Shelley, and to myriad others. But Blake in particular, and Blake is the one for me. Blake is the one whose politics, whose ideology, whose metaphysics, and whose poetry I just adore the most. I think it's beautiful. I think it's wise. I find it to be wise in an incredibly universal way, because he's describing universal human things. He's not describing like things that are entirely particular to his era. They're universal themes, they're metaphysical themes, so they apply to humanity, to its interior life, because that's what he's interested in. He's interested in the imaginative state, the soulscape of humanity, the abstract, and that's obviously what I'm interested in as well. I mean, again, if you read any of my fiction, Strange Playgrounds, Essential Atrocities, Born in Blood, that's what you're going to find. Examinations of the subconscious, of the interior landscape, expressing itself outwardly. That's what you get in Blake, and I cannot recommend reading Blake more highly. I just can't. I can't. Another one I've revisited is John Donne. And what struck me this time around, I was reading a collection of John Donne's romantic poetry, because he was quite a... John Donne was actually a priest at one time, you know. He's part of the Church of England, reluctantly by all accounts. He was kind of railroaded into it. But he's a very sexual being. Like, phenomenally sexual, John Donne. And his romantic poetry is also incredibly graphic and erotic. Okay, he uses symbolism, he uses, like, imagery to communicate the physical act of lovemaking, but it's kind of overt. It's kind of like, oh, wow, okay, that's graphic. It's very erotic. I was surprised at how overt the erotic poetry actually is, especially given his station, his loyalties, and his position. You know? You would not expect it. You would not expect... But then again, I think people are often shocked when they read work like, for example, the Earl of Rochester, the Libertine. Bloody hell. If you want to be shocked by imagery and by language, go and read the Earl of Rochester's poetry, or the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade. Most people don't read the Marquis de Sade. They just, like, assume who the Marquis de Sade was. They don't read his work. If they read his work, they'd realise that he was a brilliant man. I mean, genuinely brilliant. He was an amazing counterculture revolutionary. At a time when it was very fashionable to be very conformist, you know? And the stuff, Philosophy in the Boudoir, bloody hell, the stuff he describes in Philosophy in the Boudoir is unbelievable. It will shock you to your core. It will shock you to your core. It's shocking now. In the age of internet pornography and erotic fiction as a very well-established form of fiction, it's still shocking. It's just so... He's got no filter. The Marquis de Sade has got no filter, no parameters when he's writing whatsoever. So he doesn't have any parameter of things like age, of sex, of gender. Doesn't give a shit. Doesn't give a shit. He appreciates beauty for what it is. He appreciates pleasure for what it is. And I kind of love it. I kind of love it. Philosophy in the Boudoir is absolutely brilliant. I've got to say, it's a stunning piece of work. Also, what strikes me about Philosophy in the Boudoir, whenever I come to read it, is he's talking about things that are actually still contentious. They're universal human concepts. So he talks about things like contraception. He talks about abortion. He talks about women's rights. He talks about the status of the genders and the sexes. He talks about sexuality and sexual orientation. He talks about the hypocrisies of religion and of morality. It's all there. It's so interesting to read this guy talking about stuff that still crops up now, that still occurs in our politics and in our discourses. So interesting. Of course, I mean, there is no one as eloquent as the Marquis de Sade now, unfortunately. So there are very few people who discuss it with the same wit and the same resonance as he does, or to the same degree or with the same intelligence, but there we are. So yeah, that's what I've been up to, my loves. In fact, that's not even a shred of it. There's lots of other stuff as well I could blather on about. But yes, I hope you're all keeping well in this very fraught period, and come back to me. Do some response videos or podcasts or whatnot. Come at me with what you've been writing, what you've been exploring. I want to know. I'm interested. I want to know. So hopefully I'll hear from you soon. Until then, bye-bye.